Hi, guys. As you get started on reading The Great Gatsby over break, I just wanted to give you guys some background on F. Scott Fitzgerald's life that helped to influence what you'll see in the novel. So, I highly recommend you guys watching the documentary, Sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's available for free on YouTube, and I've linked to it in the Google Classroom. I recommend watching about the first roughly half hour of the movie that covers his life up until writing The Great Gatsby, though if you want to watch the whole 50-minute episode, you're more than welcome to do so. So, the biggest thing that you want to think about when you think about F. Scott Fitzgerald is how obsessed he was with this idea of social class. He was constantly aware that he wasn't as rich as he wanted to be, and that kind of gave him this level of resentment that he ended up having for the rest of his life. The other thing is, especially when he was younger, he constantly wanted other people to like him and he wanted to share all of his knowledge with them, whether they wanted that or not, something I can't really relate to. So let's jump in with some biographical information about F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, which was a big influence for him, even though he actually didn't spend his entire childhood there. He spent a lot of time at boarding school, as a lot of boys in his social class did. And he had two older sisters who died before he was born. So he kind of had that replacement child syndrome. But he always felt like he had this inferiority complex as a result of his parents. So his dad had this kind of old Southern family connection, whereas his mom had new family money. His mom came from the McClellans and they had earned their money, whereas his dad had that kind of like status, but he had lost all of their money. And his dad actually lost even more money with not one, but two bad business deals. So F. Scott Fitzgerald, was very insecure about these things. And he said in a letter to his editor that my father is a moron and my mother is a neurotic. Here's an example of a home that he would have grown up in. But the biggest thing is they always rented these homes and they weren't quite in the most fashionable areas. So Fitzgerald was constantly focused on these things that he wanted to be a part of, but he couldn't be. And also, the other thing to note is that a lot of his contemporaries said Scott didn't have any reason to feel this way. Like, nobody made fun of him for these things. But the biggest thing to know then is that it doesn't matter if this was based on fact, this was F. Scott Fitzgerald's perception of himself, and perception counts for a heck of a lot. So he felt he had all of these deficits. You know, his dad had failed twice in business. They didn't own this big family home where you could point at and say, like, oh, that's the Fitzgerald's place. He was also Catholic when a lot of upper class people were Protestant. And he also was just this kind of bratty little kid who was very cocky. So he felt these were the things he didn't have quite going for him growing up. And later in life, he describes in a letter to a friend that he felt he had this two-cylinder inferiority complex as a result of these differing statuses that he had, when what he really, really wanted was to belong to the upper echelons of society. So this is a passage, if you want to hit pause, you can read a little bit more, but it talks more just about how he really, really, really wanted to have more. And this social insecurity really also tied to his mother, who was his connection to money, but he also felt she wasn't posh enough for him. So, the big takeaways that I want you to remember is that Fitzgerald was never actually poor. He just really felt insecure about this, and he viewed himself as being underprivileged. So, with that, we're going to focus on his romantic interests, starting with his first love, Ginevra King. She was from Lake Forest, which is just north of Chicago. And he felt that losing her was one of the great disappointments in his life. Her dad was very against this relationship and actually said, when he was just within earshot, that poor boys shouldn't think of marrying rich girls. So she was a big influence on Daisy, and she was a big influence on Fitzgerald, specifically that he loved this rich girl but couldn't get her. The other interesting point is she had a best friend who was a famous golfer, just like Jordan Baker, our hero in, or one of our characters in The Great Gatsby. Continuing on, let's now talk about Zelda Sarah, the woman who became his wife. Zelda is often viewed as the only source material for Daisy, but as we just saw, Ginevra King was also really important on that character's creation and development as well. So he met Zelda while he was on the rebound from Ginevra King, and later, after their marriage had become to be rocky, he had talked about how he didn't like that Zelda was all artifice, like this idea that she was fake. But that's something he says once their marriage has kind of soured. So when he first met her, he was very, very into her and he proposed, and she actually initially accepted him, but then turned him down because he wouldn't have been able to support her. So after he gets turned down by her, he was also turned down by his first publisher. He takes his first novel, This Side of Paradise, and he goes back home to Minnesota and he rewrites it. And he spends this time rewriting it, knowing that he needs this book to be a success, not only because he's hungry for success, but he knows he'll never be able to marry the girl that he wants if he doesn't. So for Scott, he actually does have success. Maxwell Perkins publishes his book, and he and Zelda actually get married within days of This Side of Paradise being published and being released to the public. It is a big success right away, and both F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda become huge public figures. They're most famous for drinking and partying. Like there's famous stories of them dancing in fountains in the middle of the night. And then they do end up having a daughter who they call Scotty, who's born in 1921. And they're a happy family for a little bit of time. But unfortunately, that doesn't last terribly long. They end up moving to France for a while, and while they're there, Zelda actually has an affair with a French aviator, and she asks Scott for a divorce, to which he declines. So with this whole experience in mind, they return to the East Coast, and that's where Fitzgerald starts writing Gatsby, and he starts writing it partially to try and get Zelda back, to try to fix this marriage. So just as Gatsby is very obsessed with trying to recreate the past and win back Daisy, we see Fitzgerald himself having those feelings as well. So a lot of F. Scott Fitzgerald's own trauma and damage really plays out in The Great Gatsby. So it's important to understand that and see where those antecedents are present in the novel. The other thing you really want to remember is that social class is so incredibly important. How you are born and how much money you have is so important to these characters. We have the East Eggers like Daisy and Tom, who were always rich and always had money, and they have this class, versus the West Eggers like Gatsby, where even if you earn a bunch of money, you're never socially going to be on an equal playing field with those who were born to that. So keep these things in mind. Here's a little joke that Fitzgerald's stories always deal with a boy pursuing a rich girl, and even if he gets a ton of money, it still doesn't ultimately work out. So this is an idea that he looked at a lot in his fiction. So keep this in mind. Fitzgerald really felt that the head start that you got by being born into a wealthy family was something you couldn't ever overcome, even if you worked really hard and you earned a lot of money. And also keep in mind that Fitzgerald did have a lot of talent, but he was also obviously trying really hard. And for some people, that graded the wrong way. It's also a big story that contrasts the East Coast life with that of the Midwest, which is where Nick, our narrator, comes from, as well as Fitzgerald himself. So keep some of these things in mind as you're reading. And as always, if you've got questions, feel free to reach me out. Happy reading.